My name is Ian Wright. I'm the founder and CEO of the Disruptive Innovators Network, and I'm delighted to be hosting today's webinar on the future of people services and what's next, and to officially launch the joint report between Campbell Tickell and the Disruptive Innovators Network. We've got a really good 75 minutes for you today. We have got some administrative things for you to note. The Q&A facility is there. Q&A stands for questions and answers, so that's where we would love you to post your questions, and our illustrious panel will be able to provide the answers for you in there. You can also comment and upvote any questions, so that if they are particularly good, they'll grab my attention and I'll be able to ask them as we go through. You're all on mute, and I can't see your lovely faces today, so don't worry about that. We won't be bringing anybody up on the stage today, so we'll just be having this as a conversation, and we'll try and get through as many questions as possible. But I think it's sort of a really important day for us, because from the Disruptive Innovators Network and Campbell Tickell's side, because for a lot of organisations now, you are starting to look at what comes next for your organisation, and having been through, or still in some cases, unless you're a Scotland football fan, we are still in a pandemic, and it is going to be challenging for some considerable time, and certainly a huge amount of uncertainty. And that was why we decided to undertake this joint research, basically to give leaders working in, or responsible for, or interested in the people services, some insight into what they can look to do, or the questions they need to ask in their organisation. So the research was a qualitative piece. We interviewed a number of people within the care, the charitable, social enterprise and housing sectors, to get their views on what they think are the key issues that we need to be sort of thinking about now. And as I say, a few weeks ago, we released the report. If you haven't already done so, please download it and read it. I hope most of you have had a chance. It's a really good read. It's a very interactive report as well. So if you don't like reading, you can just watch the video clips as well. And so what we're going to do through this session is hear from some of those thought leaders who contributed to the report, get a deeper dive into some of the areas that they've flagged up, and then have a discussion as a panel, and then hopefully get some questions from yourselves so that we can answer some of the pressing issues that you might have around the people services. So as you've probably heard, as I say, we are virtual. I'm up here in the borough, and Campbell Tickell down at HQ in Wembley, where I understand there is something big happening, because Lorraine mentioned it this morning that something big is going down in Wembley. I assumed it was this webinar, but clearly there's something else going on. So, right, okay, paramedics and presenters, the two people you just want to crack on. So I'm going to invite our first speaker up to join me on stage, Gira Patel, who's a partner at Campbell Tickell and has been instrumental in contributing to this report. So, good morning, Gira.
Good morning, Ian. Good morning, panel, and good morning to everyone in our audience. I'm really sorry that we can't see you all, but I'm looking down the participant list and feeling really comforted that there's some friendly faces out there. So really good to have you here. Brilliant to have such a varied and diverse set of participants as well. So yeah, I'm not necessarily going to be one of the most interesting speakers today, because we've got three brilliant other people who are going to do that. But my role at the start of this session is just to kind of give you a little bit more texture around the research report that Disruptive Network and Campbell Tickell have put out. We hope that you found it an interesting read. We certainly found it a really interesting project to work on. It was fascinating to hear from a range of colleagues working in quite different settings about how they are thinking about their HR and people issues at this very pertinent time. So my task this morning is just to kind of draw your attention to our top 10 tips. These were the kind of the key findings that came out of our research, and we thought it might help to frame this morning's discussion if we just sort of spotlight those for you. So don't worry, I'm not going to read each of those out in detail, but I've just sort of picked out a couple of things under each of those 10 broader headings to kind of draw your draw to your attention. I do feel like when I'm sharing these tips that there's a lot of experts in our audience who are going to be thinking, yeah, well, I knew that already, you know, grandmother eggs and all of that comes to mind. But I think there's something about stating the obvious, actually, in these times. I think what I've certainly found over the last year or so is that it can be really easy to kind of rush ahead with new thinking, which is great. But I think sometimes it's important to kind of take a step back and sort of remind yourself of some of those kind of obvious things, and voice some of those obvious things. So apologies, I appreciate that I'm speaking to a bunch of experts, but yeah, I am going to draw at least attention in some areas to some of those more obvious areas. So top tip number one, and HR colleagues will absolutely kind of recognise this, but the feedback from our participants in the research was very much about, you know, you've got to have your top HR and people colleagues around the top table. This can't be an afterthought situation. I think our research points really strongly to kind of making sure that you have the voice of your HR and people experts before you even start planning, you know, when those ideas are still sort of like small seeds, or when you're starting to think kind of in that strategic space. Really important to get the views and the input of your HR and people leads, quite likely to be having them in those leadership roles, so their contributions are very much integrated into the planning and thinking that you're considering, and this is definitely not about afterthought territory. I think the last 15, 16 months have absolutely highlighted the indispensability of HR and people colleagues. And I hope that we kind of don't slip back into a kind of a back office function kind of reality. I really hope that we can kind of continue to use the leverage that's been created so that HR and people leads can continue to define their relevance and can continue to make those all important contributions. The second bit is about thinking beyond the pandemic. And I do think that this is a little bit trickier. HR and people colleagues and lots of leaders in different organisations have spent much of the last year thinking about crisis, managing crisis, thinking in the moment, responding really fast to a whole range of challenges and situations. And I think you have to be careful that that doesn't become your habitual way of working now, that you wait for something to happen and then you react to it. What our interviewers told us is that they are already needing to think beyond the pandemic, you know, whether that's about planning for the use of office space or thinking about community engagement or thinking about refreshing the systems for reward. Their advice to all of you is very much about you need to be thinking ahead right now. So whether that's 3 years or 5 years, but you absolutely kind of have to build that into your planning now. There's an acknowledgement from our interviewers that you might not have all of the detail, that some things are definitely going to be a little bit trickier to forecast. I think this is more about sort of getting your head into that longer term thinking and making that all important shift to being preemptive and being proactive. Third top tip, the office is not dead, but we are hearing, aren't we, almost on a daily basis, whether from each other, our other professional networks, even in the mainstream media, about how organisations are coming up with a varied range of responses to how they're going to think differently about existing office space. When I think about some of the clients that I'm working with now, I've got people who have got pretty much brand new, huge, enormous, shiny offices, and they're thinking about what they're going to do with those. And I've got other people who feel really grateful that they were kind of a little bit ahead of the game and had more flexible and more agile kind of working spaces in mind. There's definitely a role for the office in some settings, in some environments, and for some organisations, but that is also increasingly becoming less universal. And you'll have seen in the research, the colleagues that we spoke to had a range of really interesting ideas about how you begin and kind of conclude that debate about what's going to happen to existing office space. How do we think differently about the ways in which the ways in which we kind of come together and collaborate together, which leads really nicely onto the fourth point, which is about blended workers. Some people might say that we've been obsessed over the last year or so thinking about people who work from home, but actually vast swathes of the UK workforce don't do jobs that enable them to work from home. Huge numbers of people, probably many more than those of us who have been working from home, are actually required to be on site, required to be in their work setting in order to deliver the things that they do, whether that's services or something else. And it's really important that your people proposition isn't just focused on colleagues who perhaps have made that shift from working in an office to working from home. So think about blended workforces, think about the range of things that are taking place in your organisation and how you design HR and people systems that absolutely take account of that blend. And again, colleagues that we spoke to for the research felt that it was really critical to kind of not be overly one-dimensional about this. We've probably spent more time as leaders of people talking about trust over the last year, perhaps more so than anything else, maybe not as much as well-being, but it's certainly been up there. The idea that you have to see people in a place in order to kind of feel like they're working, in order to feel like they're getting their work done, has completely shifted. And again, the colleagues that we spoke to for the research absolutely kind of enshrined that the bit around employer and employee trust really matters and sits at the heart of this new thinking about people in terms of kind of reimagining the workplace. Linked to that is about managing well-being. Again, we've talked an awful lot about colleague well-being. We've talked much more openly about mental health. We've talked about people being allowed to have good days and bad days and how we respond to that as organisations. I think perhaps what we've talked a little less about is how we equip our managers to have these kinds of conversations. The well-being conversation in the workplace isn't one that comes naturally to all of us, and it might be something completely new for an organisation. They've been forced to think about it over the last year, but actually, how do you continue those conversations? How do you ensure that your managers know how to spot burnout, that your managers have got the right kind of language and skills and approaches in order to be having more regular conversations about managing well-being in their teams? So training for your managers was something that was really highlighted as an important feature in our research. I think in relation to flexibility and flexible working and the link between this and kind of overall productivity, there's been some really interesting research, hasn't there? Lots of interesting data floating around. Of course, people have been working longer hours. Of course, we've kind of been putting more in, but that in all situations hasn't necessarily led to huge increases in productivity. And there's an interesting correlation there, I think, and it means needing to kind of think differently about what constitutes productivity and what are those measures, those targets and outcomes for determining how people spend their time and how they get their work done and how that contributes to overall success. Some very interesting comments in this section of the research and people kind of thinking about how you bring all of those different pieces of kind of trust, well-being, flexibility and reward, which I'm going to come on to, how you bring those different pieces of that jigsaw together in order to potentially come up with quite a different way of thinking about the employee proposition. Moving on to reward, I think that HR colleagues will already know that there's a huge body of research that demonstrate that once people know that they are being paid fairly, that any monetary reward that kind of sits on top of that actually has less impact. What people are most concerned with is about leadership, is about alignment to targets, outcomes, values, visions, however it is that your organisation talks about these things. Before the pandemic, there was lots of kind of interesting stuff going on about people looking at reward packages differently, so not just focusing on salary, but actually looking at whole reward or total reward, as we used to call it. And again, I think that's kind of really shifted over the last year, and certainly some of the people experts that we spoke to shone a really kind of bright spotlight on needing, in some cases, to think about reward very differently. And so there is a greater emphasis on choice for staff, a greater emphasis on development of staff, and also increasing emphasis about thinking about quality of life, quality of work, life balance, and feeling like this last year has absolutely kind of showed us that employees have a really important responsibility around staff wellbeing, around colleague concerns, to kind of make sure that they're helping their people to manage that really well. Our ninth top tip, perhaps unsurprisingly, is about equality, diversity and inclusion. It's something that we at Disruptive Innovators Network and at Campbell Tickell, and actually across all of our interviewers, feel really strongly about. You'll read in this part of the research a range of views about how we think about ED&I in the workplace. But for me, the really kind of common theme running through all of that was honesty. Let's have some honest conversations about what's happening with regards to diversity and inclusion. I feel really strongly that this shouldn't be about problematizing individuals. I think it is about organizations needing to take a long, hard look at themselves and get into some of those challenging conversations in order to reap the benefits of what ED&I can deliver for you and your organization, and also kind of fit into that wider piece around people being able to kind of bring their whole selves to work, and how brilliant that is for organization kind of productivity and staff engagement and general sort of staff well-being. And then lastly, data. I think quite a lot of us in the group today work in environments where we have customers, and we have invested huge amounts of time and money and resources and IT systems and training, etc., 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 thinking about customer intelligence, thinking about customer data, how we collect that information, how we make better use of that information when we're planning services for our customers. There's very little. There are very few examples of organisations doing that on a routine basis when it comes to their staff, when it comes to their colleagues. We should be thinking about that tapestry, that kind of really rich tapestry of information that we've got about the people who work in our organisations, and giving consideration to how we make better use of that in order to kind of be much more evidence-based in our strategic thinking about people issues and those kind of wider considerations of how an organisation moves forward. So I hope that's been a helpful reminder of our top 10 tips coming out of the research, and I hope it helps to kind of frame the conversation to follow, particularly from our three brilliant speakers. And on that note, I hand back over to Ian. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kira. Really, really good run through there. And as I say, there's lots more within the report that sort of gives you details around where those recommendations actually came from. So before we get into talking to some of our panelists, we have a little poll question for you. Because we're really keen to sort of find out where your organizational thinking actually is. So we're going to put a little poll question up on screen, I hope. Yep, there we go. And using the poll facility, you can tick one of 4 boxes there. So the question is, to what extent are your HR people services changing in a post-pandemic environment? We're working to fundamental change across the full scope, significant change, but in a limited number of areas. You don't have to say what they are. Moderate change, but across the fullest suite of HR policies. But final point, give us 6 months, it'll be like 2019 all over again. We just want to say, just get a bit of an indication, because this will help us frame some of the questions to the panelists. So you've got 1 minute whilst I dig out a Spice Girls track to fill in the panelists, the poll there, and we'll share those findings with you. Off you go. Right, okay, you should all have been able to figure out which button to press from there. So thank you for that. And I think what we'll probably do, Zena, is show the results of that at the end. But now on to our brilliant panelists and research contributors. I'm going to bring them up one at a time because they all deserve that sort of main stage aura that we're about to sort of give them. And I'm delighted that Francesca Occosi from the Nursing Midwifery Council is able to join us today. She's the Director of People and Organisational Development. Welcome, Francesca.
Thank you. I'm pleased to be here, Ian. Good to meet you.
Yeah, good to meet you as well. Thank you again for your contribution. I think there were a few areas I wanted to sort of pick up, and probably one of the most important ones that we that you sort of talked about was around sort of well-being and well-being of people within an organisation and how they avoid sort of burnout within this. I just wondered, from your perspective, how are you advising your members within the Midwifery Council around, what to do, what are the signs, how do you manage sort of this around the whole wellbeing issue?
Absolutely. It's been quite an interesting time at the NMC, because I think one of the real challenges for us is, when you think about who we regulate and what the nurses and midwives and nursing associates have gone through over the last 15, 16 months, it kind of had an impact on our staff, a lot of who are there because they really do feel passionate about what happens in the NHS. And what we kind of found was that there was a kind of sense of imposter syndrome, I think, which has led to people working really excessive hours and a sense of not being able to complain about that, because how can we when we've got nurses and so on actually putting their lives on the line every day during the pandemic? So I think that's had quite an interesting impact on people who work at the NMC. And we did, it's fair to say that I think the kind of normal cues in a day that enable you to break up the day, getting up, getting ready, getting on the commute, coming home from the commute and so on, all went missing. So what we started to find was that staff were working, they got up, had their showers, sat down wherever they were sitting to do their work, and worked all the way through and missed all the breaks you would normally have in an office setting. And over a period of time, that really takes its toll. And that's one of the things we picked up in terms of well-being. And it's meant that managers and leaders have had to really rethink, how they manage. The ability to go in an office and kind of see that someone isn't quite their normal self, their body language isn't quite the same, and then being able to address that isn't the same when you work remotely. So we are having to think about how do we put in, those things in a day that enable you to encourage people to break up the day, to look after themselves, to give us feedback if they're struggling. Lots of things are put in to support people. So we've got a really strong mental health first aider group, lots of apps that people can use to, address if they're feeling stressed. But I think the year that we've had, or the 15, 16 months that we've had, you can't exclude the impact that the outside world has on the inside. And I think it's meant for us as leaders that we've had to really think about the people who work for us and their lives at home. So, I think Jira said earlier about bringing your whole self to work. I think leaders have to really think about the whole self of the individuals that they lead, as well as themselves. Because one of the things that I picked up when I joined the NMC was a lot of our leaders were feeling quite burnt out. And they were feeling burnt out because they felt a sense of obligation for those that they lead. And they spend a lot of time thinking about how do we become better leaders? How do we support our colleagues during this difficult time? And sometimes they're neglected themselves. So there's a number of things that we're learning, how we support, how we engage, how we kind of find different ways to help people manage their work-life balance. Because ironically, working from home hasn't necessarily increased work-life balance. In some cases, it's actually got worse. And then how we equip managers and leaders to be able to do that in a way that also safeguards their well-being. So it's been quite a journey, and I think I wouldn't say we're out of it yet, but I think what we're trying to do now is recognise that we will come out of the pandemic, and then we've got to think about what that means in the new world out there, and what that means to be a leader, and how we support the whole person who's coming into work, albeit virtually.
And is it fair to say that that's increased a lot of complexity for managers and leaders because, as you've quite rightly said, everybody's personal circumstances are different. If you're a young person in shared accommodation or you have poor Wi-Fi and things like that, So how do you think organizations are going to have to adapt where there's going to have to be a higher degree of personalization? Because somebody might be very comfortable if they've got caring responsibilities or young children to say, well, I'm going to log on at 7 o'clock at night and do a couple of hours uninterrupted.
It means you shift away from that kind of presenteeism culture where you judge a person by the fact that they came in at 8 and they stayed till 6. Actually, as a leader and a manager, you've got to judge a person by their outputs, and you've got to be flexible about how you support and performance manage them. And you've also got to think really, really carefully about the team time. And that's going to be really interesting when we move back into a hybrid setting. When are the times that you really need to have the whole team together? And you've got to take into account as a manager now, setting those times at a time that actually works for everybody in the team. Wasn't always like that. If you're in the office, you could just, set a meeting up at 9 o'clock or 2 o'clock. You're going to need to think really carefully. And I know I've had that challenge when I've been trying to find a way to bring people together. I've got to now think about it much more carefully. Who works, Monday to Friday? Who works, who's taking the children to school at 8 in the morning? So the whole way in which you lead is much more complex, and therefore we've got to equip our managers and leaders. I think Jira said it earlier, with the skills. I think the assumption that I've been a leader or manager for 20 years, I can do it. I've been a leader and a manager for 20, well, I'm not going to say how many years because that gives away my age. And I have to say this period of time has it's humbled me, because it's kind of made me realize there's a lot I've got to learn again in a totally different way.
Yeah, it's very important to understand what we can now forget, what we retain, and what we're going to have to learn in the future. So you mentioned about sort of employee engagement. One of the key things there is going to be how leaders communicate across a distributed organization. So what are you finding from your members, how their communication is changing?
Yeah, well, so actually we're getting feedback that our communication has improved during lockdown, because I think it's forced us to really spend some time thinking about putting in regular all-staff briefings, really utilizing our staff networks to engage with people, to get underneath and find out specific issues that are going on. And it's been really strange having kind of like coffee sessions and quiz sessions, and having to facilitate fun. It sounds really kind of mechanical, but you've got to put those things into the day, because you would have normally had those things, informally. You've got to actually formally build those in, and then try to tap into where staff are and how they're feeling. So, and managers finding ways to regularly engage with their team, and also and encourage collaboration and engage with individuals. And it has to be planned now. You can't just leave it down to chance. But I find that what's really been powerful for us has been tapping into our staff networks, who've really been able to support their colleagues, to flag up issues for us that we need to be hearing around, well-being, engagement issues. And so working in partnership with the wider workforce and those networks that you have in your organization is going to be key moving forward. And in some respects, I think we took them for granted pre-pandemic.
So final question for the one-to-one then, Francesca. In terms of sort of leadership and organizational development, you're responsible for this. How do you think organizations leaders are going to have to shift away from investing in management development, because we are now in very uncertain times, and moving more towards that leadership development side?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think you still need to do both, but because some of this has exposed some real gaps in basic management capability. So you've got, I call that getting your foundations, getting your basics right. But then you've got to help leaders understand that in this new world that we're moving into, that it isn't one size fits all, and that you've got to be agile, you've got to be flexible, you've got to listen to and respond to the people working with you. And that's going to be one of the really important things that we're going to be investing in our leaders. So we're going to be putting that money in, because they will define the experience of the people that we employ, who will be located all over the place now. They're not going to be necessarily located in London. So that's going to be really, really important, I think, going forward.
Okay. Well, thank you for now then, Francesca. And then I'm going to sort of neatly segue into our next panelist, Thomas Davis, who's an ex-senior Google executive and founder and CEO of I want to call it together all. Yes, I am good temper all it is, isn't it? That's what it is. There's too many alls around there. But Thomas, welcome along today, sir. And thank you again for your contribution to the report. I suppose some of the issues that Francesca was covering there, this is exactly what you're trying to sort of solve for organizations and leaders. But before we sort of get into that, one of the recommendations was around how we move HR from a support service to a strategic advisory role.
Yeah.
And I imagine that can be quite tough for other organizations, particularly if you don't necessarily have that organizational capacity. So how would you look to advise leaders to think about, lifting up the HR and people role to a more strategic footing?
Yeah, well, good morning, everyone. And firstly, thank you, Gira, for the very, very interesting. I know, I contributed towards the report, but actually listening to you again, I've already written 2 pages of additional notes, and again, thank you, Francesca. Look, I think the key thing is, executive teams all over the world, right? If you're going to go all the way go to the top, I'm just going to come off video, by the way, just to save some Wi-Fi. Executives and leaders all over the world are trying to deal with these sort of like outside external pressures. I think Francesca made reference to that have been just incredibly turbulent. Look, the reality is HR leaders sit within an executive peer group that are still trying to drive digitization, right? That doesn't go away post-pandemic, right? The second one is that, anyone who's sat within, a leadership or a board is just the pace of business now and the transience in which we're all having to operate is only getting quicker and quicker. A lot of companies that we work with, have gone from 5-year business planning to 3 years to 2 years to 1 year. There's a friend of mine, he's an ex-Google executive, he's the chief digital officer of a very well-known German company. Their strategic planning cycle is now 2 weekly. It's once every 2 weeks. That is a German manufacturing company. It takes time, it takes effort. So digitization, business transience, and the need to operate at speed. And then executives, I think, were doing a pretty decent job of understanding the importance of the organization, the people that sit within that. But I do think, and this is an area I'm particularly passionate about, is we're seeing this dilution of command and control, right? And about time too. Right, okay. So then the pandemic comes along, and HR, and Ian and I have spoken about this, regularly. Where I have seen really, really good HR teams is where they deeply understand what I've just talked about. They understand the business context, but what are we trying to achieve as a company? I was very, very fortunate at Google to have a number of HR business partners that were just wonderfully empathetic to the teams that we were looking to kind of manage and to lead. But what they're really, really good at is they also understood the pressure of business and how we were trying to kind of solve for that. But they were very data driven. It was deeply empathetic. It was very data driven. And ultimately, and Gira, you mentioned this, you mentioned evidence-based strategic decision making. And this is where I think there is a massive opportunity for HR is to use what you already have, which is actually an incredible amount of data that sits within your organization that's currently going completely unutilized. And I'm very, very excited about what people services and the HR function can bring to enterprise organizations right now. And the opportunity is right now.
So in terms of, leaders, and particularly, as I say, we're now living in a distributed world, how do leaders now understand how the work gets done?
Oh, gosh. So, if you think about something analogous like CRM, okay, we are all familiar with CRM. Okay, when I was a much younger man, and I'm also not going to give away my age, I've been around for way too long, but we used to do sales forecasting on a whiteboard and in spreadsheets, and now we're all used to having CRM systems, so customer relation management systems, that's pulling data in from across a company. People are also contributing to that data themselves. And CRM has become, incredibly well embedded. It's business as usual. What's really interesting, and again, Ian, I have some thoughts on this. If you were to walk into a boardroom as a senior vice president of sales and say, I'm about to make some really, really big decisions, and I'm looking at my CRM, but there's only 5% data in that, you would be questioned immediately on the depth and the validity of the data that was even then allowing a person to make judgment on that. And engagement and employee engagement, the very nature of the type of data, the static, the once in a moment, and just literally the depth of it, it means that people have in the last decade made really, really important decisions about people, teams, on probably 0.1% of the data they could have. And then along comes people analytics, and we've got this new paradigm. But people analytics, the very nature of that data follows the employee journey. It's how am I going to recruit people? How am I going to onboard people? How am I going to measure performance? The employee journey is not how executive teams see the data to make the decision that way, which is a vertical way. And this is what I advocate to a lot of CPOs that I've got to know, many of them my friends, is use the very best of what you've got from engagement data, from your kind of people analytics data, but use that within the wider data canvas to drive up the data validity, to allow you to make strategic decisions that can actually be held in the board. And that model, Google has done very, very effectively for over 20 years, and more companies are doing it. But I would love to see HR use data to pin that strategic decision-making on their badge, because that opportunity is there.
One of the challenges, Thomas, though, about sort of implementing workplace and people analytics, I can see it from a leadership perspective. You want to know how people are, how productive they are, how efficient, their well-being, as an example, is around that fear of snooping, privacy, intrusion. How do organizations and leaders go about implementing people or workplace analytics?
Yeah, so just remember the amount, if you think about consumerization of technology, people do things like Dropbox and Google, then you think about asynchronous tools, Microsoft Teams, or maybe Slack, the amount of data that is generated from people just doing work is it's incredible. Now, there is only one way you can do it, and you have to have it deeply done in the context of trust. You have to put the control to the organization and say, look, you have this data, but what are you looking to solve for? So the data has to be anonymized, it has to be aggregated, it has to be encrypted. And I'm a massive advocate. I'm not a big believer in productivity, to be honest, measuring product. Like, we're all working incredibly hard. The things that we see people care deeply about is work-life balance. So is there data available in the tools that we use that would allow an organization to actually give advice to people of when they shouldn't be working? And I think that is incredibly important, none more so than the post-pandemic organization. Isolation, but also there is a more growth agenda, and that's okay to talk about, which is, where do we see teams collaborate really well? What are the patterns? What are the trends? It looks like in India, there is incredible collaboration that's driving innovation. So how do we understand how they do that and start to replicate that? So I think it's about data, it's about control of that data, but ultimately using it for the things that matter the most for companies.
Okay, thank you very much, John. We'll come back and hopefully revisit those in the panel. And I'm going to introduce our third panelist now, Shireen Daniels. Welcome, Shireen. Hiya.
Hello.
Shireen's former head of people at Cafe Nero, but she's probably best known for being the founder and CEO of HR Rewired and the HR Conversationalist as well, if you've watched any of her LinkedIn conversations on there. So welcome along. And also, where we are, her latest publication here, again, which we might touch on as well. So you're a prolific sort of commentator, and I suppose, if I don't, in the nicer sense, an agitator around getting leaders to feel a little bit uncomfortable so that they ask better questions about themselves within their organization. And so I wondered from your perspective, so what does leadership look like? What is leadership going to look like to you in a post-pandemic world?
I think I'm going to touch on something Thomas mentioned, like before I started getting really interested in all the data stuff, because I love all of that. But I think this idea of external pressure coming from everything that's now happening in society in lots of different ways is causing leadership teams to all of a sudden, they can't just focus what's going on in the four walls of their organization and that be okay. You know, there's an expectation that they have views on certain things that maybe a few years ago they never even had to think about. And I think so. I remember talking to somebody in the US who said that, you know, the role of the CEO is becoming far more political, meaning they're having to engage in conversations in a way that they've never had to do before. So we're moving away from what I call king of my castle, do you know what I mean, in inverted commas. And, you know, I can do everything here and that's fine. And I can make these decisions in isolation, no matter what's going on outside. But moving forward, you now have to have this balance of, you will have your strategic direction. You will know what it is that you want to achieve and how you want to do that. But you're also going to be heavily influenced around the macro environment that you're sitting within, and understanding that's going to give different pressures and different tensions, some of which you're going to find very personally challenging, as per, you know, my subject matter expertise is in, you know, anti-racism and racial equity. That is just an example of how we're seeing this collision of not being able to put things neatly in a box and be quite you know, objective and analytical about things, because some of the decisions that you're having to make are now geared around your personal feelings. So from a leadership perspective, how do you balance this changing environment, where also your value systems and your belief systems are also being challenged? That also has an impact on how you lead, what you go after, what you ignore, to Thomas's point about, you know, people who when they shouldn't work, and how possibly that your view of the world is not as advantageous anymore because of how things are changing.
So it sounds like the role of a leader is going to become even more complex and even sort of more challenging. So how do we help them become better leaders?
I think what's really interesting is when Gira was talking about, you know, the 10 touch points almost from this piece of research that you've both done. And this piece around honesty, and I'm going to add in one more word, and trust, is massively important now, because that underpins everything. That underpins how people respond to you, how people listen, how people engage. And I'm going to add one more word actually, and that's about authenticity. So I think the piece that we can really help leaders with, most of the conversations that I have is not necessarily about the nuts and bolts about, you know, the history of racism or equity. It's about, how can you tap into who you are as an individual, be honest and open and authentic, and not hide behind your corporate veneer, that enables people to say, well, actually, I might not agree with you 100%. I might not understand with the direction of where you're going, but I appreciate the honesty and the transparency that you're giving me. For some people, that is a new world, you know, because they're used to hiding behind this shield of, you know, almost the formal CEO in a suit, metaphorically speaking, you know, a little bit closed off because you've got to have this helicopter view. And now all of a sudden people are wanting to be closer to you. They want to understand your views of the world, why you have made certain decisions or allowed certain things to happen or not happen. And so there's a level of confidence that's needed there, that some people just need a bit more support, whether that's coaching support, whether that's somebody who's going to agitate them, you know, like an accountability partner, whether that's somebody who's going to just help them see broader than the bubble that they're in, but in a safe way that they can just almost not role play, like, 'cause that sounds like, you know, like a old school training thing, but it's almost like, let's map out some of the things that you are now expected to do in a different way. How do you feel about that? And then on the receiving end, how do I perceive what you're telling me? Because that's giving me an indication of what's going on inside. So it's a very different type of leadership support, because we are tapping into people just reconfiguring how they interact with people in a very different way, and being more public and more visible now. You know, we can't just hide behind email and formal publications. People want to see video. They want to see you. They're looking at your social media tweets. They're looking at interviews that they've done. They're pulling out sound bites. So you're very visible, you know, and that's a risk if you're not spending the time to think how you turn up as an intentional, authentic leader.
So one of the recommendations was around flipping the diversity inclusion to being that's an output, not an input. So whilst COVID has not given us a blank sheet of paper, it has given organisations as close as you've got to review everything and build back in a more inclusive way. So what would be your questions or thoughts or takeaways for leaders around massively improving and changing and challenging the whole diversity and inclusion agenda?
I think there's probably three key big problems that we have in this inclusion space and diversity space. One is we use diversity and inclusion as a euphemism for dealing with racism. You know, so we saw on the back of the murder of George Floyd last year that there was a resurgence in interest in D&I. We've never seen as many job roles. If you look on any of the job sites, I think if you want to do anything in D&I, you've got opportunities, because people are now recognizing that they have to do more. But the challenge with that, though, is they're using that as a way to cover up, to say, well, we know we've got to deal with this, but let's call it diversity and inclusion, and then we'll just carry on regardless and do what we've always done. So I think going back to that point about honesty, and one of the things that I think I said in the report is when people say to me, oh, you know, Shireen, we do have an issue with, you know, representation and diversity and inclusion. I'm like, no, what you've got is an issue with racism because you've not tackled it, you know, and understanding that what we're getting into is tackling structural barriers is really important, versus just being seen to be doing something because at the moment it's what's on everybody's mind and it's in the conversations. I think the second thing is fear of saying and doing the wrong thing is paralyzing a lot of leadership teams, because they're so worried about being caught out for saying, you know, the wrong word or saying something else. And part of what I have to get them to understand is, by your inaction because of that fear, that is a privilege in itself. And that's an example of conserving power. So, because if you can't push past that, nothing changes for your organization, but nothing changes for your people who are most impacted by discrimination. So how do you get over that? And that's something to really think about. And then the third thing is, going back to Gira's point about, you know, the pandemic has made us experts in reactivity, is unfortunately many organizations only start to understand just how inequities come up in their organization because something happens. And when they're coming at it from that approach, it's sticking plaster, you know. So one of the, you know, many organizations see this whole piece about racial equity and going, well, that's fine, I just need to hire more Black people, I just need to hire more Asian people, that will solve it all. And there is no correlation between representation and racism and or the lack thereof of the presence of racism in your organization. So we've got distracted by targets and quotas, thinking that means something, you know. And I think so that's where I challenge everybody to think about, you know, where do you sit within this, and what does your version of good look like for your organization, you know, in terms of the whole piece, you know, but also recognizing that the issue with racism as a specific is about the fact that historically we have just taught people how to be very good jumpers. We've never dismantled the hurdles. And so when you understand how race and racial discrimination fits across everything, the second you laser in on the structural barriers because of people's ethnicity, when you understand the multiple identities that your employees have, whether it's gender, age, disability, sexual identification, orientation, you're already addressing some of the barriers that also marginalize those individuals who may not share ethnicity as one of their, you know, as one of the characteristics or one of the traits that are needed to address. So but you have to address the fear and discomfort and understand the difference between equality and equity, and understand that actually you might need to focus on people that you might feel uncomfortable about focusing on. And you've got to be very honest with that.
Okay, thank you very much for that, Shireen. Well, we've come back to that. I'm going to sort of bring all of the panelists sort of back up on the stage now and get some of the questions that colleagues have posted up here. First one was from Claire Norton. I suppose looking for advice around, I suppose, their operating model. There's a lot of nervousness about basically people not being available when you want to host meetings, moving towards greater flexibility of working hours. So it looks likely we will still need some boundaries on the working day. Do the panel have any advice on what they're doing or what has worked well, so that you don't have this inclusive and exclusive, i.e. people in virtual meetings attending physical meetings, etc. around that? So I just wondered, Francesca, from your perspective, how are you looking to manage that going forward?
Yeah, we're still working through that. We're just in the process actually of putting out a survey to all of our colleagues across the organisation to discuss what hybrid working is going to mean for us at the NMC. And I think, Andrea, who's our chief executive, is pretty relaxed about this sort of stuff. And I think that's really helpful when the CEO isn't fixed in how things used to be. And I think we're going to be really clear about when do people actually need to come together and how are they going to come together. So we're not going into this with it has to be everybody in the office at the same time or everybody, virtually. And we're even having that discussion with our council members, our equivalent of a board, about how we're going to run those meetings in a hybrid setting. The one thing I would say in our context is that the real challenge for us is the technology, because I don't think we've got the technology that's going to help us move there really quickly. So we're going to have to find ways of fixing that. But my view is, have an open mind and really rethink what your organization's about and how the job needs to get done. And don't be caught up in, it has to be this way. That's challenging because I'm finding it challenging. I like social interaction and I think you do certain things better together, but I'm being challenged by that, with that view, by my colleagues who are saying there are different ways of doing this and technology will help us do that. So that's the approach that we're taking. And we're also being honest and saying, we're not going to get it right every time. This is going to be an iterative process. We want you to work with us and we'll get there together, collectively. So that's how we're approaching it.
And Thomas, obviously you work in the technology space, but you work with lots of sort of clients around this. How are you finding they're adapting to this agile way of working?
Francesca's point's absolutely bang on. I think having a leadership team that are being empathetic, iterating, using data. I think for me personally, and I'm just experiencing this myself now with my own company, is that we are now learning what types of work gets done more effectively as a team. And I love using a whiteboard. I just do. I can't help it. I'll bounce up on you. But I can definitely say already now, so we've been back 3 weeks, very flexible, your choice. We're starting to see people magnetize, not just around the days of the week, but the types of work they want to do as a team. Just raw creativity, problem solving. So critical problem solving is number one. And actually just literally when we're having new people in the office, the social cues that people can give those people as they're joining, I think is quite tough to replace with video conferencing. But I reckon we're all in the same boat, which I think is fantastic. We are all learning what types of work gets done best as a team. And this will emerge, I think, over the next 6, 12, 18 months.
I think that's a really important point there, Thomas. This is one big experiment, and what will work in the next 3 to 6 months may not work in the 6 to 12 months kind of thing. So don't get too hung up on that sort of level of certainty that this is how it's going to be. It's not. I'm going to ask a really good question from Maxine Wiseman, and I'll ask this one to Shireen. How do you build a trust culture, within an organization?
I think it has to start with starts with the top, and it starts with them role modeling. Like I always say, I would love to give like a really simple way of, when people are thinking, goodness me, like, how do I start? People get their cues from other people, and your teams get their cues from how you show up as a leader. So if you have what I call a more parent-child culture, do as I say, not as I do, you are going to have lower levels of trust. But there's probably lots of data points that you can go and find, but you already know that. But if you have a leadership team that embraces honesty, that starts to think about, actually, we're not only going to just talk about the great things that we've done, we're also going to talk about the mistakes that we've made and what we've learned. That in itself, if you can start to creating those almost like honesty circles, but metaphorically speaking, and what you're saying to people is, we're recognizing when we have a job well done, but we're also recognizing the value of admitting when we're wrong. That immediately builds trust, because it makes people feel like, one, it's okay for me to make mistakes and own up to that rather than hide it. Because when there's a lack of trust, that's when people hide things. When also there's a lack of trust, that's when people stay very quiet about things that actually are eroding all of the good work that you're trying to do. Whether it's culture transformation or whether you're trying to think about inclusion. So the way that you can reverse engineer that is actually to say, if there are things that we should be talking about, if there are things that aren't right, we need to get better at putting that on the table. And that has to start with us first, because that's what people will trust. If it's all bright and shiny, and all good news, people are like, that's great, but there's it's almost like the multiple elephants in the room of all these things that aren't quite going right. So you have to kind of face into that and be okay that that's going to make you uncomfortable as well. But that will build trust, because then people will like, well, if they're telling me everything's okay and we're doing all right, I believe it, because when it's not, they also let us know. So that would be my advice.
Okay, thanks, Sheree. I'm going to try and get through, I think it's 4 more questions I want to sort of get through, and I'm just working my way up from the screen. I mean, Vicky McDermott raises a really good point. This is all quite good within the organisation, but how do you bring boards along with you on this journey? Francesca, I presume you get to work with quite a few boards within your organisation. What would your view be around that?
Yeah, well, I think it's, again, having an open conversation, because I think, coming back to what Shireen said, the board set is part of the leadership, and if they're not saying and doing the same things, it's going to be a real challenge making the change. So we're in the process at the moment of developing our new people strategy, and I'm going to be doing a workshop with the board, and they've already asked me questions about what do you think? What are we thinking about hybrid working? What is going to be the notion of work? How are we going to make this work? So they actually want to be part of that dialogue. So I think it's recognizing that people on boards have had jobs, some of them are still working, they bring lots of experience, they're in the same world as us, and actually they've got some great insights. So we're going to have the debate and discussion and land where we think is the right thing for us as an organization. And they will own that decision. That's why they need to be involved. And then they'll hold us to account for making that culture, that environment work. So it is having that dialogue, bringing them into it, getting their insights, and then owning what you decide to do collectively. So that's how we're going to do it at the NMC.
And Claire asked an interesting question, Thomas. I don't know whether you've got any thoughts around this, around increasing reliance around email for remote working. Surely there must be other better channels of collaborating and communicating.
It's a really good question. I could talk for hours on this, but the short answer is, if we think back to how a majority of technology within the workplace has been used for the last, honestly, 15, 20, 25 years, like email and calendaring systems, that style, for those that are familiar with it, it's called kind of synchronous. You're synchronizing with someone to do some work. And then about 10 years ago, this sort of notion of asynchronous working came along. So if you've used Slack, which is channel-based, you're working together in real time, and it's a very, very different way of working. It's really interesting. I've spent 25 years doing synchronous, and now 95% of my work is asynchronous, because you choose when you want to engage on that channel, not I'm sending you an email, unless you reply, I'm going to be pissed off. It's a totally different way of engaging as a company. Asynchronous is one of these things that will become in my view, way more business as usual in the next 5 or 6 years. Now, the challenge is that we've currently got one foot in both camps. We're trying to do a bit of synchronous, a bit of asynchronous. So I'm doing channel-based, but then I've also got 10 VCs every day, and I can't go into the... We're in a tough place, and I would advocate is find the tooling that is really flexible to meet the needs of your people and your teams. And I'm a big believer that cream will rise to the top. People will self-identify those tools, those methods that allow them to work most effectively. So 2 choices. I'm a big fan of asynchronous.
Okay, thank you very much, Thomas. And Shireen, one for you from James Dean around who do people think should take the lead in the new work environment when you're bringing together people, tech, and all of the different facilities functions? How do you make that work effectively?
I think you have to choose who's going to be ultimately accountable. Do you know what I mean? It's a bit like that old-fashioned racy model. Do you know what I mean? But think about who's going to be accountable. But I think also the flip side, I would say, is we have to do a better job of what I call co-creation. I think too often we're really good at being really prescriptive to people about, this is what we perceive as the direction. This is how we perceive it to be done. So therefore, we're just telling you the what. And I think we miss opportunities, kind of like what Francesca was saying about the board, but we miss opportunities to get deeper insights from our people and let them feel like they're co-creating this direction too, because we've seen over the last year, when employees aren't happy with the organisation and what's going on, they take it to what I call the streets externally. There's lots of different reasons. So you want to counteract that, and because otherwise you get these 2 lanes going on, where, whether it's the board, whether it's a working group over here going, right, this is the direction and we're off. And the employees are on a completely different, different wave of thinking. And they're, in some instances, obstructing that, or in others, creating their own version of where they think you should be going. So that co-creation piece is important. And I think it has to be a mixture of HR. It has to be a mixture of your CTO. It has to be it's just a mixture. You also have to think about equity and inclusion within all of that as well, and really bed that in together. So there's almost like you have these people asking very different questions, rather than everything sitting with one person, but you do have overall accountability. I think when we start getting into too siloed thinking, people become single points of failure. So it's almost like, how can we empower, how can we loosen our reins a little bit and allow a bit more co-creation, but be really clear on the roles and responsibilities for those of us who are, ultimately responsible for the delivery of this and keeping us on track.
Okay, final question, because we're going to be running out of time, but Davina's asked the question about the recent announcement by a large energy provider that they don't have a people service and don't feel the need for one. So I suppose my question to all 3 of you is actually, is what we're talking about fairly irrelevant now? Is the report already out of date? Do organizations actually need a people service? Francesca?
I think you know what my answer to that question is going to be. And it's going to be, of course they do, but they do need the right type of people service. Too often I've gone into really transactional people services that are just there as the police and the people who tell you what you can and will actually work from the basis of telling you what you can't do, and they're not adding strategic value. I think we've got a really critical role to play in making sure that those aspects around what makes an organization tick, which is essentially it's the people, is done. Is part at the heart of what you're doing. At the NMC, I think we're a people business. We're a business delivered by people, for people, with people. So there's absolutely no way that you can't have a strategic voice at the table of in terms of a people services director. But they've got to be doing the right things. They've got to be adding value. It's not about policing process and policy. It's about actually changing outcomes and making a real difference at the end of the day. And if we're not doing that, we don't have a right to be there.
Okay, well, I'll probably have to sort of end it there, because I'm just conscious. I want to sort of bring Gira in to sort of bring all of this sort of together. So sorry if we didn't get around to asking everybody's question. We did get through quite a few there. And I think, Gira, it would be good if you could sort of just bring everything to a conclusion with a few questions for colleagues to go away and ask within their organisation based on the research and based on the contributions today.
Can I just quickly say that the chief executive of that energy company has never employed a people director like Francesco? Because if he had done, I don't think he'd be saying that. But anyway, so some questions from me in terms of some takeaways, actually. So we'd like to leave you with these in order to kind of continue to provoke your thinking and help you to kind of see the value of coming together and talking about these things. So firstly, how influential is the HR lead in your organization? If, as Francesca has said, you're a people business, if you find yourself saying things like people are our greatest assets or customers are at the heart of our business, then actually if your HR lead isn't at the top table, isn't in all of those important strategic planning conversations, then how does that stack up? So ask yourself how influential your HR lead is, and if they've got the right kind of voice, as Francesca was saying, then are you missing out on the contribution that they could make? I think the second thing for me would be the question around how are you going to invest in leadership, and how is that different from what you used to do before the pandemic? So if your investment in leaders before the pandemic was perhaps about structured programs or learning modules or whatever those things are, and I'm sure they still have a role to play, but actually what do we need to do differently in terms of leadership development, because we have asked a range of different things of our leaders in the current environment, and there are new challenges and opportunities coming over the horizon. So how do we equip our leaders for those, and think about leadership development that isn't just about the people at the top? Actually, in a lot of large organizations, those middle tiers of management are the people who are most influential in your organization because they manage the bulk of your staff. So ask yourself, actually, in pounds, shillings and pence, what's the level of investment that you've put in leadership for those people who occupy those middle tiers of management? I think in relation to the office, how are you going to ensure that your discussion about the office isn't just confined to the physicality of that space? How are you going to be able to take a more rounded view about actually there's no singular definition now of the office space, and our work environment is much more varied, needs to continue to be varied, and how might you consider future use of office space, but with the broadest kind of definition? I think in relation to well-being, I'd go back to the piece around investing in leaders. How are you equipping your managers to bring well-being into their day-to-day, quarterly, annual, whatever it may be, into their management conversations? How are you making sure that well-being forms a part of, keeping an eye on well-being, getting ahead of well-being, forms a part of the package of what it means to be a brilliant manager anyway, and that it no longer is something that kind of sits out there and we talk about what's happening in the organization, and by the way, we also talk about well-being. How are you going to integrate well-being into those management conversations? I think the fifth point, the headline is kind of about productivity, and this partly relates to a couple of questions that Claire asked. Hello, Claire, nice to see you. I think, what will it take to shift your conversations with staff from talking about things to do, task list, got to do this, got to do that? What will it take to shift the conversation to actually, what have you achieved? What have you what kind of impact have your outputs had? And if we can make some of those shifts in the tone of that conversation, I think that can also take into that bit around sort of the rigidity of working hours. So if we're less focused on what people have got to do and more about what they've been able to do, I think that kind of brings in the sort of flexible working kind of issues that we've talked about. And I think it also kind of builds in the bit about trust that Shireen and other colleagues were saying. And I wonder if that tone of conversation shifts from, you've got to do this, let's look at your things to do list, to much more about what have you achieved, what have you accomplished, what impact has that had, how has that made you feel. I think we can kind of wrap up a few things with that shift in conversation. I think in relation to talent attraction, I'm a great believer in your reward package says a lot about who you are as an employer. So I think the question for me is, ask yourself what your current reward package is saying about you, and is there misalignment between these lovely things that you're saying over here about vision and values and employee engagement, and then perhaps there's a kind of a old-fashioned way of looking at reward, perhaps a kind of a kind of a traditional way of looking at reward that actually now doesn't align to other things that you're saying about your people. So ask yourself the question, what does our reward package say about who we are as an employer? Is it distinctive enough? Is it rounded enough? I think in relation to equality, diversity and inclusion, my panel colleagues have said it all. I'm going to go back to a word I think that I used and Shireen used, which is about honesty. I really, really kind of want to urge you to ask yourself what might be a pretty tough question. How honest have we been in my organisation about matters to do with race and wider matters to do with equality, diversity and inclusion? And if we haven't been honest with ourselves about what's going on and why those things go on, why is that? What is it that we're afraid of? What is it that we think we're going to find really difficult? Again, to kind of quote Shireen, there's something about getting comfortable with feeling uncomfortable. And frankly, for all of us, if that's not where this conversation is going, then you're having the wrong kind of conversation. So I think the question absolutely has to be about how honest have we been as a conversation. And then finally, in relation to data, I think my question would be, have a look at all of the data and information that you collect about your customers and how you make use of that data in your organisation and how it influences decision making in your organization. And then ask yourself, how does that compare to the data that we collect and use in terms of our staff colleagues? And is there a mismatch there? And how might we close some of that gap? Because surely, if it's our people who are going to be responsible for delivering those fantastic customer services, that brilliant customer experience, then surely we need to know more about our people. We need to know what makes them tick. We need to kind of think about how we might employ, I don't know, nudge theory, or kind of really understand sort of motivations for people and understand where they're at. And I think there's a wealth of data within your organization to really help you think about that. But I think most of us either don't have access to that or haven't thought about colleague data, perhaps in the same way that we've been thinking about customer data. So my question there is, how do those two different data sets match up? If there's misalignment, what might you do about that? So I hope that those are useful questions to take away with you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kira. Yeah, very comprehensive there. I know we've held on to most people because they wanted to see the results of the poll. So as if by magic, there we go. Yeah, and I suppose what you would expect, fundamental change across the organised, fundamental change and significant as well. And only 2%, one person, will be going back to how things were. So thank you very much, colleagues, for staying on and for your contributions. Thank you to all of our panelists, to Francesca, to Thomas, to Shireen, to Zena, for keeping everything on track and keeping us right. And almost we're finishing on time there as well. So thank you for that. And thank you to all of the contributors for the report. I hope it's a very useful document for you to keep referring back to.